Good news, everyone. The average 30-year mortgage rate finally has a 5 in front of it, and you can almost hear America sigh in relief. A report from the Wall Street Journal yesterday showed that average interest rates on a 30-year mortgage have gone down to 5.98% for the first time since 2022, which to me that feels 10,000 years ago. What's driving the fall in rates? For sure, demand is part of it. First-time mortgage applications were down again this month. And in January, new home sales were down by 8.4%. A lot of that is because nobody's going to open houses when there's ice all over the ground. But for sure, demand cooled off right along with those temperatures. But a bigger factor, I think, in the decrease in mortgage rates is the interest rate yield of certain government securities, particularly the 10-year Treasury bond. Now, some of you may have thought that I was going to talk about the federal funds rate. Back in July, President Trump famously was criticizing Fed Chair Jerome Powell and the Board of Governors for being too late to lower interest rates. And he blamed that for choking out the housing market and making it difficult for people to buy a house. There is a broad correlation with the decrease in mortgage rates. But the far more important government security is the 10-year Treasury. And I'll explain why. The 10-year Treasury is basically the government borrowing money for a 10-year period of time. And the way it works is the Treasury says to you, to me, to investors, to our pension funds, mutual funds, hey, you give me the money for 10 years. And in return, I'll give you that money at the end of 10 years, and I'll give you an interest payment in the meantime. And that interest payment will beat inflation, and that will hedge your cash against inflation in a comparatively safe way. It's a way to basically guarantee, at least on the full faith and credit of the United States, that you're going to beat inflation. And that rate is set by the market based on the best expectations about what's likely to be inflation in the next 10 years, what's likely to be the case with unemployment in the next 10 years, how's the economy expected to grow or to shrink. All of those things get baked in to the 10-year Treasury rate. And so if those things, as they go up or down, that rate will fluctuate with them. Now, that rate is related in some way to the federal funds rate. So when President Trump was criticizing Fed Chair Powell, he was saying that the federal funds rate needed to go down in order to allow mortgage rates to go down. But what you can see is those relationships between the federal funds rate and the 10-year Treasury rate are not automatic. There may be economic indicators that justify lowering interest rates right now, but don't necessarily look good on the 10-year horizon. The 10-year Treasury yield is influenced by, among other things, the creditworthiness in the minds of investors of the U.S. Treasury. And that credit rating has taken some damage in the last several years as every major credit rating agency has downgraded the creditworthiness of the U.S. government as a borrower. Not a lot, but a little. And what you'll see is right here in September, when the federal funds rate was lowered for the first time, what happened on the 10-year market is that you can see here, the 10-year Treasury rate bumped. Investors have to buy the reasoning that the Fed uses to lower the rates. And initially, at least, they didn't. What you can see is that while over this cycle, there have been 3 drops in the federal funds rate, the 10-year Treasury rate has basically stayed flat, sometimes increasing, but mostly staying flat. So there's an increasing gulf between the federal funds rate and the 10-year Treasury rate, which suggests that the market is not convinced that the 10-year horizon looks as ripe for interest rate cuts as the immediate horizon. Why does that matter for mortgage rates? The 10-year Treasury is one of the key terms that most banks use in giving you a mortgage, in setting the mortgage rate. So they basically take the 10-year Treasury and then they add to that interest rate their estimation of the creditworthiness of the borrower, the desirability of the asset, and what its likely resale value will be, a number of other things like that all go into just adding. So basically you have the 10-year federal funds rate plus borrower and asset specific considerations. You take those two things together, and that's usually what the interest rate is going to be. That's why in COVID, when the federal funds rate was effectively 0%, a lot of people, when they got mortgages, they didn't get 0% mortgages, but they got 1%, sometimes maybe 2%, because that's just the bank's little addition of risk management into the whole equation. But by and large, as the 10-year Treasury rate goes down, mortgage rates go down with it. As it goes up, they go up. So it's been stubborn, but it is cooling. So that's great. Yields are down from last year, so mortgage rates have slowly come down with them. Now, the relationship between 10-year treasuries and mortgage rates is an important one, but another major factor in the question is the affordability of housing in general. And here's where the news isn't so good. Again, just as the president blamed Jerome Powell for the inaccessibility of credit to buy houses last year, he has also blamed private equity firms and investors for driving house prices up. And it's true that private equity has increased their investments in single family housing over the last several years. And that probably does exercise a kind of modest inflationary effect on prices in that it's a buttress for demand. But the biggest driver of housing demand in the last several years is not private equity or investment. It's the massive injection of cash in the post-COVID economic rescue efforts. If you look here, you can see that this is a chart showing the money supply. And what is basically after COVID, there was an enormous infusion of government money printing. It raised the money supply in a couple of years by 35%. And in doing so, basically pulled forward a decade of housing appreciation. Now, this makes sense, right? Because you can see if you project this trend line out past the current date, it's probably around 2030, maybe 2031, that you would have seen the money supply grow to the level that it reached immediately after COVID. And so what happened is there was suddenly an enormous rush of cash into the economy. And when there's too much money chasing too few goods, prices inflate. That's the inflation that we felt in the last couple of years of the Biden administration. That money supply came in two forms. It came via direct transfers of cash to people from the government. We all remember those checks. And at the same time, interest rates by the Fed were effectively zero. So you had people flush with cash, and suddenly the housing market was massively accessible because the credit was so cheap. And so what that did is it loosed a flood of new buyers into the housing market, and it took every buyer from being a buyer at one level to potentially being a buyer at a higher level. This is something called the marginal upgrade effect. And what it means is that when buyers have more cash, they not only buy houses they wouldn't have bought, they buy bigger houses than they would have bought. That marginal upgrade effect carries with it not just the higher cost of buying the house, but also the higher costs associated with ownership at different price levels. So when you buy a bigger house, you not only have the cost of the house, you have the greater cost of maintenance, the greater cost of repairs, the greater cost of insurance, of property taxes, all of those expenses. And as they increase, it exercises a broadly inflationary influence on the cost of homeownership in general. Now, what it did is it created a massive inflation that was felt everywhere in the economy. And the very next thing that happened, the Fed, in order to do something about that inflation and cool it, had to raise interest rates. So we've shown how the rates have gone down over the last year. But if we back this out to the 5-year window, you can see that in the COVID times, that the Fed rate was basically zero. And then they basically raised it to over 5% over the course of about a year's time. The inflationary effect on the housing market had not yet cooled, and suddenly the cost of credit became prohibitive. And so you have high inflated house values and impossible mortgage rates. And those two things together created a generational crunch that for a lot of people has locked them out of the housing market forever. And given that housing is how the middle class stores its wealth, as more and more people see the housing market isn't accessible, the economy starts to look like it's not for them. And the thing that drives me a little nuts about this is that both of these things directly were caused by the dysfunctional relationship in the United States between government revenue and government spending. Even if you think that all of that spending to rescue the economy from a COVID-driven collapse was necessary, even if you think that, what happened is the deficit went up to about 15% of GDP from its pre-COVID level of about 3.5 to 3.8% of GDP. And then it settled afterwards to double it with no crisis and no war and no pandemic. Deficit spending hasn't gone down. And that spending caused the inflation that then also caused the corresponding rate hike by the Fed. All of that was caused by government spending that had no relation to the actual ability of the government or the economy to absorb it. And this is why running $2 trillion deficits in peacetime is bad. The deficit path of the US is bad. This is why our debt path is so bad. It's not because it's bad for countries to be in debt. It's because what's happening is federal budgeting is divorcing itself from economic reality. And as it does that, we're going to see more and more of that same dynamic where infusions of government cash into the economy create the exact problems that they are meant to solve. And affordability will become more and more a paradox of government action to ensure it actually taking it away. The reason that people can't afford housing right now is not because of BlackRock. It's because you can't increase the money supply by 35% and expect prices to stay what they are. And as the US continues down its path of recklessness, all of those numbers are going to get wildly more and more distorted. The national debt crisis and deficit crisis is an affordability crisis. They are the same thing. Ironically enough, that is the grounds for my biggest hope, because in the late 1970s, when inflation rates were double digits and when home mortgage rates were in double digits, that's when Congress received the record number of applications inside of a decade for an Article 5 convention that would create a constitutional amendment holding Congress's feet to the fire on fiscal responsibility. When Americans get hit in their home prices and in their energy prices, when those things happen, that's when Americans get up in arms. The only thing that could possibly derail that is if politicians successfully convince Americans that the problem is with BlackRock, or the problem is with investors, or the problem is with energy companies. All of these are rounding errors in terms of what is actually applying the upward pressure on prices and on access to credit. The biggest story, without question, in that sphere is Congress's reckless use of the nation's credit card. And I believe that affordability is the sort of thing that will get them to stop it, which is why they work so hard to deflect. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe if you're into this sort of thing. Make sure you hit that bell notification so that you know every time we post here at GDP. And I'll see you next time.